When Kane Williams walked into Belmore's fine dining with his wife and 2 kids to celebrate his big promotion, the hostess looked at them like they didn't belong. She said their reservation didn't exist, even though Kane showed her the proof right on his phone. His 7-year-old daughter Jasmine didn't understand why the mean lady wouldn't let them sit down. His 12-year-old son Dante felt his hands turn into fists as he watched his dad's shoulders drop. This was supposed to be the best night of their lives, but instead it was turning into their worst nightmare. Just when Kane was about to leave with his family's heads hanging low, the restaurant door opened behind them. A tall man walked in, and suddenly everything changed. The same hostess who had just turned them away started acting completely different. Her whole face lit up like Christmas morning. She rushed over to greet the man like he was royalty. That's when Kane realized who had just walked through that door, and what happened next would change his family's life forever. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the pavement outside Belmore's fine dining, casting long shadows across the pristine white exterior that had become a landmark in the affluent Chicago suburb of Winnetka. Inside the restaurant's air-conditioned entrance, Kane Williams stood with his wife Elena and their 2 children, 7-year-old Jasmine and 12-year-old Dante, waiting to be seated for what was supposed to be a celebration dinner. Kane had just received a promotion at the architectural firm where he had worked tirelessly for 8 years, designing buildings that would stand as testaments to human ambition and creativity for decades to come. Elena had made the reservation 3 weeks earlier, specifically requesting the table by the large bay window where golden afternoon light would stream in and make everything feel magical and special. The children had dressed in their finest clothes, Jasmine in a yellow sundress that made her look like a dancing sunflower, and Dante in the navy blazer and khakis that made him appear suddenly older, as if childhood was already beginning to slip away from him like sand through open fingers. The hostess behind the polished mahogany podium was a woman in her early 30s, named Christine Mayfield, whose blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. She looked up from her computer screen as the Williams family approached, and something shifted in her eyes, something cold and ancient that had been passed down through generations like a diseased heirloom. Kane smiled warmly, unaware of the storm that was about to break over his family like a wave of ice water. He gave Elena's name for the reservation, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had earned his place in the world through dedication and hard work, never imagining that his accomplishments could be rendered invisible by something as arbitrary as the color of his skin. Christine's lips pressed together in a thin line as she stared at the computer screen for what seemed like an impossibly long time, her fingers motionless on the keyboard. The silence stretched between them like taffy being pulled to its breaking point, and Kane felt Elena shift uncomfortably beside him, her hand finding his and squeezing gently. Finally, Christine looked up with eyes that contained all the warmth of a January morning in Antarctica. She informed them that there must have been some mistake with the reservation, that the system showed nothing under Elena's name, and that unfortunately the restaurant was completely booked for the evening with no available tables. Her voice carried the practiced politeness of someone who had learned to weaponize courtesy, turning each word into a small blade that cut without leaving visible wounds. Kane felt confusion wash over him first, followed by a creeping realization that began in his stomach and spread through his chest like ice, forming on a winter lake. He pulled out his phone and showed Christine the confirmation email that Elena had received, the one that clearly stated their reservation time and table number, the one that proved they had every right to be there. Christine barely glanced at the phone before shaking her head, repeating that there must have been a technical error, that these things happened sometimes with online booking systems, that she was terribly sorry but there was simply nothing she could do about it. Dante, who was old enough to understand the subtext that hung in the air like smoke, felt his jaw tighten as he watched his father's shoulders slump ever so slightly. He had seen this look before, this particular kind of exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness, that spoke to a weariness of spirit, that came from fighting battles that should never have needed to be fought in the first place. Jasmine, still too young to fully comprehend what was happening, tugged on her mother's sleeve and asked in her clear, innocent voice why the lady was being mean, why they couldn't sit down and eat the fancy pasta she had been dreaming about for weeks. Elena bent down and whispered something to her daughter, something meant to be comforting but that came out sounding hollow even to her own ears. Kane considered arguing further, considered demanding to speak to a manager, considered making a scene that would at least leave a mark on this pristine establishment that had just rejected his family like contaminated merchandise. But he also thought about his children, about the lesson that would be taught by watching their father humiliated in public, about the way trauma could imprint itself on young minds like a brand burned into leather. Just as Kane was preparing to turn away, to guide his family out of this place that had made it abundantly clear they were not welcome, the front door opened behind them with a gentle whoosh of warm air from outside. The late afternoon sun streamed in, silhouetting a tall figure whose presence seemed to shift the very atmosphere of the room. At first no one paid much attention because they were all caught up in their own private drama, this small tragedy playing out in the entrance of an upscale restaurant that prided itself on exclusivity and tradition. But then Christine's face underwent a remarkable transformation, her expression shifting from cold dismissal to shocked recognition to obsequious delight in the span of about 3 seconds. Her hand flew to her chest as if she needed to physically restrain her heart from leaping out of her body, and she stammered out a greeting that was so saturated with reverence it would have been comical under different circumstances. The tall man who had just entered was dressed casually in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, but there was something unmistakable about his presence, something that spoke to greatness achieved and battles won on courts that became arenas for human excellence. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had long ago made peace with his own legend, who understood that his face was recognized in every corner of the globe, but who had somehow managed to retain a core of genuine humanity beneath the layers of fame and fortune. Michael Jordan scanned the restaurant's entrance with eyes that had seen everything from the highest peaks of triumph to the deepest valleys of personal loss, eyes that had had to read situations with the same precision he had once used to read defenses on a basketball court. He noticed the Williams family immediately, noticed the way they stood slightly apart from the hostess stand, noticed the tension in Kane's shoulders and the protective way Elena had positioned herself slightly in front of her children. Noticed the confusion on Jasmine's face and the anger beginning to simmer in Dante's eyes. Christine rushed around the podium with an eagerness that would have been embarrassing to witness under normal circumstances, gushing about what an honor it was to have him at Belmore's, asking if he had a reservation or if she could arrange a table immediately, assuring him that they would make room no matter how fully booked they were. The irony of this statement hung in the air like the smell of something burning, and Michael Jordan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle hardening around his eyes that suggested he understood exactly what he had just walked into. He raised one hand to slow Christine's enthusiastic welcome, his gesture carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention without needing to raise his voice. He asked in a tone that was perfectly polite but carried an undercurrent of steel, whether there was some kind of problem at the hostess stand, whether these folks here had been taken care of yet. Christine's face flushed a deep red that clashed spectacularly with her blonde hair, and she began to stammer something about a reservation mix-up, about technical difficulties with their booking system, about how these things sometimes happened and there was really nothing anyone could do. Kane watched this exchange with a mixture of emotions that he would later struggle to articulate to Elena in the quiet darkness of their bedroom. There was relief that someone had noticed, that someone with undeniable power and influence had witnessed their humiliation and was apparently choosing not to ignore it. There was also a deep, aching sadness that it took the intervention of a celebrity, a man whose face appeared on everything from sneakers to sports drinks, to make their dignity matter in this space. He wondered what would have happened if Michael Jordan had not walked through that door at that precise moment, how they would have left this place with their heads held high, while their hearts broke a little, how they would have tried to explain to their children that some people still carried hatred in their hearts, like a cherished heirloom passed down through generations. Dante stared at the basketball legend with wide eyes, his anger momentarily displaced by the surreal quality of having one of his heroes suddenly appear in the middle of this nightmare scenario. Jasmine had no idea who this tall man was, but she recognized kindness when she saw it, recognized someone who had looked at her family and seen human beings worthy of respect rather than problems to be dismissed. Michael Jordan turned his attention fully to Kane and his family, and his eyes conveyed an understanding that went beyond mere sympathy. This was recognition from someone who, despite his wealth and fame, remembered what it felt like to be judged by something other than the content of his character or the measure of his accomplishments. He had grown up in North Carolina during a time when segregation was still a living memory, when the ugly tentacles of racism still reached into every aspect of daily life, and he had experienced his own moments of rejection and humiliation that no amount of championship rings could completely erase. He asked Kane if they were here for dinner, and when Kane nodded and explained about the reservation that supposedly did not exist, Michael Jordan turned back to Christine with an expression that managed to be both pleasant and absolutely unyielding. He informed her that he had actually not made a reservation himself, but had simply stopped by on impulse, and that it would be wonderful if she could seat all of them together at a large table, since he would very much enjoy dining with this lovely family. The transformation in Christine's demeanor was instant and total, as if someone had flipped a switch that controlled her entire personality. Suddenly, the computer system was working perfectly. Suddenly, there was a beautiful large table available right by that bay window where the golden light poured in. Suddenly, everything that had been impossible 5 minutes ago was not only possible, but would be arranged immediately with the utmost care and attention. She grabbed menus with hands that trembled slightly, whether from embarrassment or excitement or fear. It was impossible to tell, and led them through the restaurant's main dining room, where other patrons began to notice who was walking past their tables. Whispers rippled through the space like wind moving across a wheat field. Heads turned, phones were surreptitiously pulled from pockets to capture this unexpected moment. But Michael Jordan kept his attention focused on the Williams family, asking Jasmine about her pretty yellow dress, and telling Dante that he hoped the young man was working on his jump shot. They settled into a large circular table that could have easily accommodated 8 people, positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon light that made the white tablecloth glow like fresh snow. Elena felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the kindness of this stranger who had no obligation to involve himself in their situation, but had chosen to do so anyway. She tried to thank him, to express her gratitude in words that felt painfully inadequate for the magnitude of what he had just done. But Michael Jordan waved away her thanks, with a gentle smile that suggested he understood that gratitude was insufficient currency for this particular transaction. He told them that nobody should be treated the way they had been treated, that it was completely unacceptable, and that he hoped they would allow him the pleasure of their company for dinner, because it got lonely eating alone in these fancy places. His casual tone made it seem as if he had not just intervened in a situation that could have scarred 2 children's understanding of their place in the world, as if he had not just used his considerable influence to force a correction of an injustice that played out in countless variations across the country every single day. The waiter who approached their table was a young man named Kevin, who looked absolutely terrified to be serving Michael Jordan, his hands shaking slightly as he poured water into their glasses and recited the evening specials in a voice that cracked with nervousness. Michael Jordan put him at ease with practiced charm, asking questions about the menu items and treating Kevin with the same respect he might have shown to a head of state or a fellow athlete. He encouraged Jasmine to order anything she wanted, telling her that celebrations were important and should be honored properly, and when she chose the lobster ravioli that cost $45, he told her she had made an excellent choice. Dante, emboldened by the basketball legend's genuine interest, began asking questions about championship games and famous shots, and Michael Jordan answered each one thoughtfully, sharing stories that revealed not just the glory of winning, but the hard work and sacrifice that preceded every moment of triumph. As the conversation flowed around the table like a gentle river, Kane found himself observing this surreal situation with a mixture of gratitude and grief. He watched his son's face light up as Michael Jordan described the feeling of hitting a game-winning shot in the final seconds, watched his daughter giggle at a funny story about a practical joke involving squeaky shoes, watched his wife begin to relax as the tension slowly drained from her shoulders. But he also could not stop thinking about the fundamental injustice of the fact that it had taken a celebrity's intervention to grant them access to something they had already earned through proper reservation and simple human dignity. He thought about all the black families who had experienced similar rejections without a Michael Jordan walking through the door, all the moments of humiliation that happened in shadows and silence, all the children who internalized the message that they were somehow less deserving of respect and courtesy than others. The food arrived in waves of culinary artistry, each plate arranged like a small sculpture, and Michael Jordan insisted that they try various appetizers that he ordered for the table. He told them about growing up in Wilmington, about how his mother had taught him the importance of grace under pressure, about how his father had instilled in him a work ethic that became the foundation of everything he would later achieve. He spoke about the time he had been cut from his high school basketball team and how that rejection had fueled his determination to prove himself, to become undeniable through sheer excellence. He talked about the racism he had encountered throughout his career, the subtle and not so subtle ways that people had tried to diminish his accomplishments or reduce him to a stereotype, and how he had learned to channel that pain into motivation rather than allowing it to poison his spirit. Jasmine, who had initially been shy around this tall stranger, began to open up like a flower responding to sunlight. She told him about her ballet class and how she wanted to be a dancer when she grew up. And Michael Jordan listened with genuine interest, asking questions about her recitals and encouraging her to pursue her passion with the same dedication that had made him successful. He told her that greatness came in many forms, that the discipline required to master ballet was no different from the discipline required to master basketball, that what mattered was finding something you loved and refusing to let anyone tell you that you could not achieve it. Dante asked about the famous flu game, about how Michael Jordan had managed to play through illness and still dominate, and the basketball legend's answer revealed not just physical toughness, but mental resilience, the ability to push through barriers that seemed insurmountable to others. As the meal progressed and the golden afternoon light began to fade into the purple hues of early evening, other diners in the restaurant kept glancing over at their table with expressions that ranged from curiosity, envy to barely concealed resentment. Some people approached nervously to ask for autographs or photographs, and Michael Jordan accommodated them graciously while always making sure that the Williams family remained included in the conversation, never allowing his celebrity to completely overshadow the reason he had chosen to sit at this particular table. Elena noticed how carefully he navigated these interruptions, how he used his influence to keep the focus on celebrating Kane's promotion and honoring the occasion that had brought the Williams family to Belmore's in the first place. When someone asked what brought him to this particular restaurant, Michael Jordan simply smiled and said he had heard great things about the food and had been lucky enough to meet some wonderful people to share it with. The restaurant's owner, a portly man named Gerald Thornton, whose family had operated Belmore's for 3 generations, eventually made his way to the table with the nervous energy of someone approaching a dangerous animal. He greeted Michael Jordan with the kind of deference usually reserved for visiting dignitaries, thanking him profusely for choosing their establishment and asking if everything was to his satisfaction. Michael Jordan's response was measured and deliberate, his words carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly how to leverage his influence for maximum effect. He told Gerald that the food was excellent, but that he had been troubled by what he had witnessed when he first arrived, troubled by the way this family with a confirmed reservation had been turned away, troubled by the clear implication that their business was not welcome at Belmore's. He said these things calmly and without raising his voice, but there was steel beneath the velvet of his tone, a quiet assertion that this behavior was unacceptable and would not be ignored simply because he happened to be present. Gerald's face went through several shades of red before settling on a purple that suggested either embarrassment or impending cardiac arrest. He stammered apologies that sounded hollow even to his own ears, making excuses about system errors and miscommunication and staff training issues, all the usual defensive mechanisms that people employed when confronted with evidence of discrimination. Michael Jordan listened to these excuses with an expression of polite skepticism, then turned to Kane and asked him directly if he felt that the situation had been handled appropriately by the restaurant staff. Marcus, who had spent most of his adult life learning to navigate these moments with careful diplomacy, felt something shift inside him as he met Michael Jordan's eyes and saw genuine interest in his answer, genuine respect for his perspective. He spoke honestly for the first time that evening, describing how Christine had dismissed them despite having clear proof of their reservation, how her tone and body language had communicated that they were not the kind of clientele that Belmore's wanted to serve, how painful it had been to see his children's excitement turn to confusion and hurt. The other diners in the restaurant had gone quiet, straining to hear this conversation that was unfolding like a play on an improvised stage. Some of them looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and suddenly finding their wine glasses fascinating objects worthy of intense study. Others leaned forward with undisguised interest, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, a moment when the usual social scripts were being rewritten by someone with the power and courage to demand better. Gerald Thornton tried to salvage the situation by offering to comp their entire meal, by promising that he would personally ensure this never happened again, by making vague statements about diversity training and inclusive policies. But Michael Jordan cut through these platitudes with surgical precision, pointing out that the Williams family should never have needed his intervention to receive basic courtesy and respect, that the problem was not just one hostess but a culture that had allowed this kind of discrimination to feel permissible. He then did something that surprised everyone at the table, including Kane himself. Michael Jordan pulled out his phone and made a call right there in the middle of the restaurant, speaking to someone about setting up a foundation initiative focused on addressing discrimination in public accommodations, about creating a reporting system for incidents like this one, about using his platform to shine a light on the daily indignities that black families continued to face despite decades of supposed progress. He spoke with the casual authority of someone accustomed to turning ideas into reality, someone whose wealth and influence gave him the power to create systems and structures that could outlast individual moments of kindness. Kane listened to this one-sided conversation with a growing sense of awe, realizing that what had started as a personal humiliation was being transformed into something larger, something that might prevent other families from experiencing the same treatment. When dessert arrived, an elaborate selection of pastries and chocolate creations that Jasmine regarded with wide-eyed wonder, the mood at the table had shifted entirely. What had begun as a rescue operation had evolved into something closer to a genuine friendship, or at least the foundation of one, as Michael Jordan continued to draw out stories from each family member. He asked Kane about his architectural work, displaying surprising knowledge about design principles and urban planning, revealing that he had always been fascinated by the way buildings could shape human experience and community interaction. He spoke with Elena about the challenges of balancing career and family, about how his own marriage had struggled under the weight of constant travel and public scrutiny, about lessons learned too late to save some relationships, but valuable nonetheless. He connected with both children on their own levels, treating Dante's basketball obsession seriously, while also engaging with Jasmine's completely unrelated interests in ballet and horses. As the evening stretched on and the restaurant began to empty out, Gerald Thornton returned to their table with a woman he introduced as the restaurant's board president, someone who apparently held real authority over policy and personnel decisions. She was a distinguished-looking woman in her 60s, named Margaret Reeves, who carried herself with the confidence of old money and established power. But unlike Christine or Gerald, Margaret did not seem interested in making excuses or deflecting responsibility. She looked directly at the Williams family and offered an apology that sounded genuine, acknowledging that what had happened to them was inexcusable and represented a failure of the restaurant's values and training. She then turned to Michael Jordan and thanked him for bringing this incident to the ownership's attention, for caring enough to make it an issue rather than simply enjoying his celebrity status and ignoring the suffering of others. Michael Jordan accepted her words with a slight nod, but made it clear that the real test would be in the actions that followed, in whether Belmore's would implement meaningful changes to ensure that this kind of discrimination did not continue. He suggested that the restaurant might benefit from diversifying its staff and management, from creating clear protocols for handling reservations that could not be dismissed at the whim of a prejudiced hostess, from establishing relationships with community organizations that could help educate employees about unconscious bias and systemic racism. Margaret listened to these suggestions with the focused attention of someone actually taking notes mentally, and she promised that she would personally oversee the implementation of these changes and would welcome Michael Jordan's continued input and accountability. As they finally prepared to leave the restaurant several hours after they had first arrived, Kane found himself overwhelmed by the strangeness of the entire evening. What should have been a straightforward celebration dinner had turned into something far more complex, a mixture of humiliation and rescue, pain and healing, personal hurt, and broader social commentary. Michael Jordan insisted on paying for the entire meal despite Kane's protests, saying that it was the least he could do and that he wanted the Williams family to remember this evening as a celebration rather than as the beginning of a traumatic memory. He wrote his personal phone number on the back of a business card and told Kane to stay in touch, expressing genuine interest in seeing Kane's architectural work and in hearing updates about the children's progress in their various pursuits. Outside the restaurant, as the warm summer evening wrapped around them like a blanket and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Michael Jordan knelt down to Jasmine's level and told her something that she would remember for the rest of her life. He said that she lived in a world that would sometimes try to make her feel small, that would sometimes judge her by the color of her skin rather than by the brilliance of her spirit, but that she should never let anyone else's limitations become her own. He told her that she had as much right as anyone to take up space in the world, to dream big dreams and pursue them relentlessly, to demand respect and refuse to accept anything less. Jasmine nodded solemnly, not fully understanding all the words, but grasping their essential meaning, sensing that this tall man with the kind eyes was giving her something precious and important. To Dante, Michael Jordan offered different advice, counsel shaped by the recognition that a 12-year-old black boy in America faced particular challenges and dangers that required both awareness and resilience. He talked about the importance of excellence, about making yourself so good at something that people could not ignore or dismiss you, about channeling anger and frustration into productive action rather than destructive reaction. He warned Dante that the world would often be unfair, that he would face situations where he would be judged more harshly and given fewer second chances than his white peers, but that this reality made it even more important to develop discipline and self-control. He spoke about the burden of representation, about how society often judged entire communities based on individual actions, and while that was unjust, it was also reality that had to be navigated strategically. Kane shook Michael Jordan's hand with genuine warmth, trying once more to express gratitude that still felt inadequate for what had transpired. Michael Jordan clasped Kane's hand firmly and told him that he saw something of himself in Kane's determination to provide for his family and create opportunities for his children, that he respected the quiet dignity with which Kane had handled a situation that would have justified much more dramatic protest. He encouraged Kane to keep pushing forward in his career, to refuse to let incidents like this one diminish his confidence or make him question his worth, to remember that true character was revealed not in moments of triumph, but in how one responded to unfair adversity. Elena hugged Michael Jordan impulsively, tears streaming down her face as she thanked him for seeing their humanity when others had chosen blindness, for using his power to defend rather than merely to accumulate more privilege. As they walked to their car in the parking lot, the Williams family moved in a kind of daze, processing everything that had happened over the past few hours. Jasmine chattered excitedly about the fancy desserts and the nice tall man who had been so interested in her ballet, already beginning to construct a child's version of the story that would emphasize the positive rather than dwell on the painful parts. Dante was quiet, turning Michael Jordan's words over in his mind like precious stones being examined from different angles, beginning to understand that he had witnessed not just a celebrity encounter, but a masterclass in how to wield power with grace and purpose. Kane and Elena held hands in the front seat as Kane started the engine, and they sat there for a moment before pulling out, looking at each other with expressions that conveyed entire conversations without words, acknowledging that something significant had shifted in their understanding of the world and their place in it. The drive home took them through neighborhoods that gradually shifted in character from commercial to residential, from wealth to middle class, from the manicured perfection of Winnetka to the more modest but equally well-maintained streets of their own community. Kane thought about the irony of having to rely on Michael Jordan's intervention to receive basic respect, but he also recognized that what could have been a moment of pure victimization had been transformed into something more complex and ultimately more hopeful. His children had witnessed both the ugly persistence of racism and the possibility of solidarity across lines of fame and fortune, had seen that not everyone with power chose to ignore injustice, that sometimes help arrived from unexpected quarters. Elena stared out the window at the passing houses with their lit windows, suggesting countless other families going through their own evening ritual, and she wondered how many of them had ever experienced the particular flavor of humiliation that came from being rejected simply for existing in a body that society had decided was less valuable. When they finally pulled into their own driveway, their modest but comfortable house looking warm and welcoming with the porch light glowing like a beacon, Jasmine was already half asleep in her car seat, her yellow dress rumpled and her face sticky from chocolate mousse. Dante helped carry his sister inside while Kane and Elena lingered for a moment in the driveway, breathing in the familiar smell of their own neighborhood, grateful to be home but also changed by the evening in ways they were only beginning to understand. Kane thought about the architectural drawings waiting for him in his home office, the projects that represented years of education and hard work and steady climbing up ladders that others seemed to ascend effortless. He thought about the promotion he had earned through countless late nights and weekend sacrifices, about how his accomplishments should have been sufficient to guarantee his family's welcome in any restaurant or store or public space, but about how they clearly were not. Elena thought about the reservation she had made so carefully 3 weeks earlier, about how she had wanted everything to be perfect for this celebration, about how naive she had been to imagine that having money and making reservations in advance would protect her family from the kind of discrimination that her own parents and grandparents had faced. She thought about the conversation she would need to have with Jasmine in the coming days, about how to explain what had really happened at the restaurant in terms a 7-year-old could understand without crushing her spirit or making her afraid of the world. She thought about Dante and how much harder it would be to protect him as he grew older and society began to see him not as a child, but as a threat. How his skin would mark him as dangerous long before anyone bothered to discover his gentle heart and quick mind. That night, after the children were tucked into bed and the house had settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, Kane and Elena sat together on their back porch, watching fireflies dance across their small yard. They talked about everything that had happened, processing the events from multiple angles, trying to make sense of the complex emotions that swirled through them like competing currents in a river. They talked about Michael Jordan and his unexpected kindness, about whether it was right to feel so grateful for what should have been unnecessary intervention, about what it meant that their dignity had required a celebrity's endorsement to be recognized. They talked about Christine, the hostess, and whether she had acted alone or as part of a broader pattern at Belmore's, about whether the promised changes would actually materialize, or whether the restaurant would simply wait for the attention to fade before returning to its discriminatory practices. Kane expressed his conflicted feelings about the whole evening, about how ashamed he felt that he had not been enough on his own to secure his family's right to eat at a restaurant, about how his education and career success had proven insufficient in the face of ancient prejudices. Elena reminded him that this was not about his inadequacy, but about a system designed to protect certain people while excluding others, about how individual merit and accomplishment meant nothing in the face of structural racism that operated like gravity, pulling everything and everyone down to predetermined positions. She told him that he had handled the situation with grace and restraint, that he had protected their children from additional trauma by choosing not to escalate into a scene that would have left lasting scars, that there was no shame in accepting help when it was offered by someone who understood the nature of the struggle. They talked about whether they should report what had happened to some kind of civil rights organization, whether they should share their story on social media where it might gain traction and force accountability, whether they should simply try to move on and focus on the positive aspects of Michael Jordan's intervention. They discussed the burden of being forced to constantly make these calculations, to weigh the cost of speaking up against the toll of remaining silent, to consider how their actions might affect not just their own family, but the broader community of Black Americans who faced similar indignities every single day. Kane wondered aloud whether they had a responsibility to pursue formal complaints precisely because Michael Jordan's involvement gave their story the kind of credibility and attention that most discrimination cases never received, whether they owed it to others who suffered similar treatment without any celebrity witnesses to validate their experiences. As the night deepened and the fireflies faded, as exhaustion began to overtake the adrenaline that had sustained them through the evening, Kane and Elena finally went inside and prepared for bed with the comfortable routines of a long married couple. But before they turned out the lights, Elena checked her phone one more time and gasped at what she saw. The story of what had happened at Belmore's was already spreading across social media, posted by other diners who had witnessed the confrontation and captured parts of it on their phones. The narrative was being shaped in real time by strangers, some of whom praised Michael Jordan as a hero while others criticized the restaurant's discriminatory practices, some of whom questioned why the Williams family had not fought back more aggressively while others expressed sympathy and shared similar experiences of their own. Within hours, the incident had become national news, picked up by major outlets hungry for stories that combined celebrity involvement with social justice themes. Television reporters stood outside Belmore's describing what had happened, interviewing community members about their experiences with the restaurant, pressing Gerald Thornton and Margaret Reeves for statements about how they would address the systemic problems that had been exposed. Christine, the hostess, became the subject of intense public scrutiny and anger, her social media accounts flooded with messages ranging from disappointed criticism to outright threats. The restaurant faced calls for boycotts from civil rights organizations, while simultaneously experiencing a surge of interest from people who wanted to eat where Michael Jordan had dined, creating a bizarre situation where the same incident that exposed their discrimination also increased their visibility and business. Kane watched all this unfold with a growing sense of unreality, as if the private trauma his family had experienced was being dissected and debated by millions of people who had not been there, who could not fully understand the particular sting of being rejected while dressed in your finest clothes and ready to celebrate a hard-earned accomplishment. He saw commentators on news programs discussing his family as if they were abstract examples rather than real people with feelings and privacy concerns, saw their names and photos circulating without consent, saw his children's faces broadcast to the world in a way that felt like yet another violation of their dignity. He had not asked to become a symbol or a cause, had simply wanted to take his family out for a nice dinner, and now they were caught in a maelstrom of attention that threatened to define them forever as victims, rather than as whole human beings, with complex lives and multiple dimensions. Michael Jordan released a statement through his representative acknowledging the incident and calling for meaningful action to address discrimination in public accommodations. He announced that he would be working with civil rights organizations to develop training programs for restaurants and other businesses, that he would be using his considerable wealth to fund initiatives aimed at documenting and challenging discriminatory practices, that he would not allow this moment to be simply forgotten as soon as the news cycle moved on to the next story. True to the promise he had made at the dinner table, he was transforming a single incident into the foundation for broader systemic change, leveraging his fame and resources in ways that could potentially benefit countless families who would never have Michael Jordan walk through the door at the moment they needed him most. In the weeks that followed, the Williams family's life was turned inside out by unwanted attention. Reporters camped outside their house, hoping for interviews. Strangers sent messages of support and solidarity along with occasional hate mail from people who resented their story or questioned its truthfulness. Kane's employer called him in for a conversation that walked the fine line between expressing support and subtly suggesting that maybe he should try to keep a lower profile for the sake of the firm's reputation and client relationships. Elena had to deal with other parents at school who suddenly treated her differently, some with excessive sympathy that felt patronizing and others with awkward distance, as if discrimination might be contagious. Jasmine became confused and upset when kids in her ballet class asked her questions about the restaurant that she did not understand, forcing Elena to finally have the conversation she had been dreading about why that lady had not wanted to seat them at first. Dante struggled the most with the aftermath, old enough to fully grasp what had happened and young enough to feel powerless to do anything about it. He became withdrawn and angry, getting into fights at school with kids who made comments about his family or about Michael Jordan's involvement, questioning why they needed a rich, famous person to make other people see them as human beings worthy of basic respect. He started spending hours watching videos of Michael Jordan's greatest basketball moments, studying not just the athletic excellence, but the fierce competitive drive that seemed to burn through the screen, trying to understand how someone channeled pain and adversity into fuel for greatness, rather than allowing it to become poison that destroyed from within. Kane noticed his son's struggles and tried to talk to him about it, sharing his own experiences of discrimination and explaining that anger was natural but had to be directed strategically rather than exploding in ways that would ultimately hurt Dante more than anyone else. The promised changes at Belmore's did materialize, though whether they resulted from genuine reflection or calculated public relations remained unclear. Christine was quietly let go without any public statement about the reasons for her departure, allowing the restaurant to distance itself from her actions while avoiding legal liability that might have come from explicit acknowledgement of discrimination. The entire staff underwent mandatory training about unconscious bias and inclusive service, though the effectiveness of such programs was always questionable when they were implemented as damage control rather than as part of authentic institutional commitment. Margaret Reeves established a community advisory board that included members of local civil rights organizations, creating at least the appearance of accountability and ongoing dialogue about how the restaurant could better serve all members of the community. Michael Jordan followed through on his promise to stay in touch with the Williams family, calling Kane occasionally to check in and even stopping by their house once when he was in the Chicago area for business. His continued interest in their well-being felt genuine rather than performative, suggesting that something about their encounter at Belmore's had resonated with him on a deeper level than mere publicity or charitable impulse. He attended one of Jasmine's ballet recitals, sitting in the back row to avoid creating a distraction, but making sure to congratulate her afterward on her beautiful performance and her obvious dedication to her craft. He invited Dante to attend a basketball camp that he sponsored, where the boy received coaching from former professional players and began to channel his anger and energy into athletic excellence that might one day earn him opportunities his father's generation could only dream about. But despite all this positive attention and the genuine kindness that Michael Jordan continued to show their family, Kane and Elena both understood that their story was an exception rather than a rule, a fortunate accident of timing that had transformed what should have been a forgettable trauma into something that at least carried the possibility of broader meaning. They thought about all the other families who experienced similar discrimination without any witnesses, without any social media documentation, without any celebrity interventions to validate their experiences and force accountability. They thought about the restaurant hostesses and store clerks and hotel managers and countless other gatekeepers who made snap judgments about who deserved access and courtesy based on skin color rather than on any legitimate criteria. They thought about how exhausting it was to navigate a world that required constant vigilance, constant code switching, constant calculation about which battles were worth fighting and which were better left alone to preserve energy for the next inevitable confrontation. Kane threw himself into his work with renewed intensity, channeling his frustration into designs that pushed boundaries and challenged conventional thinking about how spaces could be organized to promote inclusion rather than reinforce hierarchies. He began specializing in projects for community centers and public buildings, places where architecture could make statements about equality and accessibility, where the physical environment could either welcome everyone or subtly communicate that some people belonged more than others. His promotion had come with the authority to choose his own projects to some degree, and he used that freedom to focus on work that felt meaningful beyond mere aesthetic or commercial considerations. His colleagues noticed the shift in his approach, the way his designs now seemed infused with social purpose that went beyond the technical requirements of building codes and client specifications. Elena used her experience as a mother navigating these conversations with her children to start a blog about raising black children in predominantly white suburbs, about the particular challenges of preparing kids for discrimination, while also encouraging them to believe in their own potential and worth. She wrote about the incident at Belmore's not as a story about Michael Jordan's heroism, but as an example of the daily microaggressions and outright prejudices that black families faced, even in spaces where they theoretically had every right to exist. Her writing resonated with other parents who had struggled with similar situations, and gradually she built a community of readers who shared their own stories and strategies for protecting their children while also teaching them resilience and self-advocacy. She became a voice for families who felt caught between the desire to shield their kids from racism and the necessity of preparing them for a world that would judge them harshly. Jasmine, in the way that children have of processing trauma through play and imagination, created elaborate stories about princesses who were not allowed into fancy castles until magical heroes appeared to help them gain entrance. Elena watched her daughter act out these scenarios with her dolls and stuffed animals, recognizing that Jasmine was working through what had happened at the restaurant in the only way a 7-year-old could, by transforming it into a fairy tale with clear heroes and villains and happy endings. She did not interrupt or try to correct these fantasies, understanding that children needed their own methods of making sense of experiences that adults struggled to explain. But she also made sure to have conversations with Jasmine about how real-world problems required real-world solutions, how waiting for magical heroes meant accepting powerlessness, how the goal was to become strong enough that you did not need anyone's permission to take up space in the world. Dante's relationship with basketball intensified after attending Michael Jordan's camp, where he had been surrounded by other young black athletes who understood the particular pressures of trying to achieve excellence while carrying the weight of representation and stereotype. The coaches at the camp had talked openly about racism in sports, about how black athletes were often praised for natural talent while white athletes were credited with intelligence and work ethic, about how the same behaviors that made white players seem confident and assertive made black players appear arrogant and threatening. They taught the boys about channeling anger productively, about using the chip on your shoulder as motivation rather than allowing it to make you reckless and self-destructive. Dante absorbed these lessons like a sponge soaking up water, recognizing that he was being given tools for navigating a world that would never be entirely fair, but that could still offer opportunities for those who learned to play the game strategically. As months passed and the immediate media attention faded, the Williams family settled into a new normal that was shaped by but not defined by what had happened at Belmore's. They discovered that they could not return to the innocent assumptions they had held before that evening, could not pretend that making reservations and having money in the bank would protect them from discrimination, but they also refused to allow that knowledge to make them fearful or small. Kane and Elena made a conscious decision to continue taking their children to restaurants and museums and theaters, to insist on their right to occupy public spaces, even when that occupation required constant vigilance and occasional confrontation. They talked openly with Jasmine and Dante about racism as an ongoing reality rather than a historical artifact, preparing them for encounters that would test their resilience and require them to make difficult choices about when to fight back and when to protect their own peace. The story of what had happened at Belmore's took on a life of its own, becoming part of the broader national conversation about discrimination and privilege, about the persistence of racism in supposedly enlightened, liberal communities, about what it meant to be an ally with actual power versus someone who simply posted supportive messages on social media without taking any real risks. Some people held up Michael Jordan as an example of how celebrities should use their platforms, praising his willingness to intervene and his commitment to following through with systemic changes rather than just enjoying good publicity from a single generous gesture. Others criticized him for being part of the problem, arguing that wealthy black celebrities who achieved acceptance in elite spaces had an obligation to completely reject those spaces rather than trying to make them more inclusive, that integration was itself a compromise with white supremacy rather than a challenge to it. Kane found himself invited to speak at various events about his experience, and though he initially resisted these invitations out of a desire to protect his family's privacy and move on with their lives, he gradually came to see them as opportunities to shape the narrative rather than allowing others to define what had happened. He developed a talk that focused not on Michael Jordan's heroism, but on the exhausting reality of having to constantly prove your worth in spaces that should welcome everyone equally, on the psychological toll of never knowing whether poor service or rude treatment resulted from individual incompetence or racial bias, on the particular burden that black professionals faced of representing their entire race in predominantly white environments. His presentations were honest and unflinching, refusing to soften the edges of his anger or pretend that a single positive outcome had erased the fundamental injustice of what his family had experienced. Elena's blog evolved into something more substantial, eventually leading to a book deal with a publisher interested in authentic voices discussing the realities of raising black children in America. She wrote about the specific challenges of suburban integration, about how families like hers occupied a strange liminal space between the predominantly black urban communities they had left behind and the predominantly white suburban communities that tolerated their presence without fully accepting them. She explored the complex emotions of wanting better opportunities for your children, while also mourning the loss of cultural connection that often accompanied moves to whiter neighborhoods, about the way that upward mobility could feel like a betrayal of the communities that had nurtured you, even as it opened doors that had been locked to previous generations. Her writing resonated because it refused easy answers or comfortable narratives, acknowledging the messiness of choices that involved trade-offs between different kinds of belonging and safety. Jasmine grew into a confident performer who seemed to carry herself with unusual self-possession for someone so young, as if that evening at Belmore's had planted in her a seed of understanding that she would not allow the world to diminish her just because some people could not see her worth. Her ballet teacher noticed that she danced with a fierce determination that went beyond mere technical proficiency, that she seemed to be making some kind of statement with her body about claiming space and demanding attention. Elena watched her daughter's performances with a mixture of pride and heartbreak, recognizing that Jasmine's strength had been forged in part through pain that no child should have had to experience, grateful that her daughter had not been broken by discrimination, but also wishing that such resilience had not been necessary. Dante's basketball skills improved dramatically under the influence of the training he had received at Michael Jordan's camp, and the mentorship of coaches who understood the particular pressures faced by young black athletes. He grew taller and more confident, his body transforming from child to young man in the accelerated way that seemed to happen overnight. And with that physical transformation came a deepening understanding of how the world would see him and what that meant for how he needed to move through space. Kane had difficult conversations with his son about interactions with police, about keeping his hands visible and speaking respectfully, even when being treated unfairly, about the reality that skin color could make routine encounters deadly in ways that had nothing to do with individual behavior or character. These conversations felt like a theft of innocence, like having to teach a child to carry burden that should never have been his to bear, but they were also necessary survival training in a country where black boys became threats in the public imagination long before they became men. Michael Jordan's foundation did launch the initiatives he had promised at that dinner table, creating programs that trained businesses on inclusive practices and established reporting mechanisms for discrimination that went beyond individual complaints to identify patterns suggesting systemic problems. The foundation funded legal assistance for families who experienced discrimination but lacked resources to pursue formal complaints, and it worked with civil rights organizations to document the ongoing reality of racial bias in public accommodations. These efforts represented more than mere charity or public relations, reflecting a genuine commitment to using wealth and influence to challenge structures that had persisted long after legal segregation had supposedly ended. Michael Jordan himself remained personally involved, not just lending his name, but actually participating in strategy sessions and using his relationships with other wealthy individuals to expand funding and support. The Williams family maintained periodic contact with Michael Jordan over the years that followed, their relationship evolving from gratitude-based obligation into something more genuine and mutual. He invited them to basketball games where they sat in premium seats and watched athletic excellence that reminded them of human potential at its peak, and they invited him to family gatherings where he could experience the warmth and connection of people who saw him as more than just a famous face. These interactions were meaningful precisely because they transcended the circumstances that had first brought them together, because they represented a choice to remain in each other's lives rather than allowing their relationship to be defined entirely by that single evening at Belmore's. Michael Jordan told Kane that he saw in their family something that reminded him of his own upbringing, a combination of ambition and groundedness that kept success from becoming empty achievement. and Kane recognized that the basketball legend's interest in them was partly about maintaining connection to the communities and struggles that wealth and fame could insulate you from if you were not careful. Years later, when Dante was preparing to graduate from high school with a basketball scholarship to a prestigious university, and Jasmine was performing lead roles in regional ballet productions, Kane and Elena reflected on how far their family had come since that evening that could have broken them but had instead become a catalyst for growth and purpose. They acknowledged that in some terrible way they had been lucky that Michael Jordan had walked through that door at precisely the right moment. Lucky that their humiliation had been witnessed and validated rather than occurring in shadows where so much discrimination happened without consequence. But they also recognized that their story should not have required luck, that basic human dignity should not depend on the random intervention of celebrities, that the system itself needed to change rather than relying on individual acts of kindness to correct ongoing injustices. The incident at Belmore's became part of their family's mythology, a story that was told and retold with different emphases depending on the context and the lesson that needed to be taught. Sometimes it was a story about unexpected allies and the importance of using privilege to defend others, focusing on Michael Jordan's intervention and the changes that had resulted from his willingness to get involved. Sometimes it was a story about resilience and dignity in the face of discrimination, focusing on how Kane and Elena had handled a painful situation with grace, while also refusing to simply accept mistreatment. Sometimes it was a story about the persistence of racism, even in supposedly progressive spaces, a reminder that wealth and education and accomplishment provided no immunity from prejudices that ran deeper than rational thought. Each telling revealed different facets of truth, different aspects of an experience that contained multitudes and resisted simple summary or moral. Kane achieved significant success in his architectural career, eventually starting his own firm that specialized in community-oriented design projects that prioritized accessibility and inclusion. His buildings made statements about who belonged in public spaces, using architecture as a form of activism that challenged assumptions about hierarchy and worth. He hired young architects from diverse backgrounds and mentored them through challenges that he understood from personal experience, creating opportunities for talent that might otherwise have been overlooked by firms that valued pedigree over creativity. His success felt meaningful precisely because it was connected to purpose larger than personal advancement, because it represented not just individual achievement, but an attempt to reshape the built environment in ways that could subtly influence social relationships and power dynamics. Elena's book about raising black children in predominantly white communities became required reading in many education programs, used by teachers and counselors trying to understand the particular challenges faced by families navigating integration decades after the civil rights movement had supposedly solved these problems. She received invitations to speak at conferences and universities, sharing insights that came not from academic theory but from lived experience and hard-won wisdom. Her work helped create vocabulary and frameworks for discussing issues that many people preferred to ignore, forcing uncomfortable conversations about how racism adapted and persisted even as its most obvious manifestations became socially unacceptable. She became a voice for parents who felt caught between protecting their children and preparing them for harsh realities, arguing that love sometimes required difficult truths rather than comforting lies. Jasmine pursued ballet professionally after college, becoming one of the few black women in an art form that had historically been even more exclusively white than most elite spaces. She faced discrimination that was often subtle, but no less damaging. Comments about her body type not fitting classical ballet aesthetics, assumptions that she would be better suited for modern dance or other forms that did not require the same technical precision. Surprise when she demonstrated capabilities that challenged stereotypes about black dancers and athleticism versus artistry. But she persisted with determination that had been forged in part during that evening at Belmore's. carrying with her the memory of Michael Jordan kneeling down to tell her that she had as much right as anyone to take up space in the world. She became a role model for young black girls who dreamed of dancing on prestigious stages, proving through her excellence that beauty and grace came in all shades. Dante played college basketball with distinction, though not quite at the level that would lead to a professional career, eventually transitioning into coaching, where he could pass on the lessons he had learned about using sports as a vehicle for developing character and resilience. He worked with young athletes from disadvantaged backgrounds, teaching them not just basketball skills but life skills, preparing them for encounters with racism and inequity that would test them off the court just as much as any opponent tested them during games. He incorporated into his coaching philosophy ideas drawn from that evening at Belmore's and the subsequent camp with Michael Jordan, ideas about channeling anger productively and refusing to internalize society's limited expectations. His players respected him because he spoke honestly about challenges they would face, rather than offering false promises that hard work alone would overcome all obstacles. The Williams family never returned to Belmore's, despite the restaurant's attempts to invite them back for complimentary meals and photo opportunities that would demonstrate their commitment to inclusion. Kane and Elena decided that they had no interest in being used as props for the restaurant's rehabilitation, that their dignity was not for sale even at the price of fancy free dinners. This decision was not about holding grudges, but about maintaining boundaries, about refusing to make others comfortable at the expense of their own well-being. They found other restaurants where they celebrated family milestones and achievement, places that welcomed them warmly from the first moment without requiring celebrity intervention or media pressure. And these experiences reminded them that not all spaces were hostile, even if they could never let their guard down completely. Michael Jordan himself moved on to other causes and initiatives, though he occasionally checked in with the Williams family and continued to support the foundation programs that had grown out of that evening at Belmore's. His intervention in their lives had been significant and life-changing, but it was also just one small part of a much larger career devoted to excellence and to using the platform created by that excellence to address injustices that he had experienced firsthand throughout his own journey. The encounter at Belmore's reminded him of why this work mattered, why wealth and fame carried responsibilities beyond personal enjoyment, why the doors that had opened for him needed to be propped open for others rather than allowed to slam shut behind him. He understood that his role was not to save every family facing discrimination, but to use his unique position to challenge systems and create structures that could outlast any individual moment of kindness. As Kane sat in his home office many years after that fateful evening, looking at architectural drawings for a community center that would serve families from all backgrounds, he thought about the strange trajectory that had led from humiliation at a restaurant hostess stand to the life and career he now enjoyed. He thought about how that single evening had crystallized so many truths about American society, about the persistence of racism beneath surface claims of progress, about the random nature of justice that depended so often on who happened to witness your suffering, about the exhausting work of maintaining dignity in spaces that constantly communicated that you did not belong. He thought about his children and the adults they had become, shaped by that experience but not defined by it, carrying forward lessons about resilience and resistance that would serve them through whatever challenges still lay ahead. He thought about Christine, the hostess, whose snap judgment had set in motion a chain of events she could never have anticipated, and he wondered whether she had learned anything from the experience or simply resented the consequences that had disrupted her life. He thought about all the other Christines working at hostess stands and retail counters and hotel desks across the country, making similar judgments every day without anyone famous walking through the door to challenge them, without social media documentation to force accountability. He thought about the families who experienced rejection without any rescue, who went home and tried to explain to confused children why they had been treated as less than human, who carried these wounds in silence because speaking up seemed pointless or dangerous or simply too exhausting on top of everything else they had to carry. And yet, despite all this knowledge about ongoing injustice, despite understanding how exceptional rather than typical his family's story had been, Cain felt something close to hope when he considered how far they had come and what they had managed to build from the wreckage of that evening. Not the naive hope that racism would simply disappear if enough people heard their story, but the harder, more durable hope that came from choosing to keep showing up in spaces that did not always welcome you, from insisting on your right to exist fully and completely rather than making yourself small to accommodate others' prejudices, from teaching your children that they were worthy of respect even when the world failed to provide it, from building communities of support that could sustain you through inevitable disappointments and betrayals. The story that had begun with rejection at a restaurant hostess stand had unfolded into something much larger and more complex than anyone could have predicted that evening. It had become a story about celebrity intervention and random kindness, yes, but also about the ongoing work of challenging discrimination in all its forms, about the complicated relationships between individual incidents and systemic problems, about what it meant to raise black children in America with both awareness of obstacles and confidence in their own potential. It had become a story about architecture, both literal and metaphorical, about how we build physical spaces and social structures that either welcome everyone equally or communicate through 1,000 subtle signals who truly belong. It had become a story about resilience, not as passive endurance but as active resistance, about refusing to accept limitations that others tried to impose based on nothing more substantial than ancient prejudices and irrational fear. Most importantly, it had become their story to tell on their own terms rather than a story told about them by others, a narrative that they shaped through the choices they made about how to respond to injustice, how to use their platform as reluctant symbols to challenge systems rather than simply accepting individual remedies, how to remain connected to broader struggles for equality while also protecting their own family's well-being and privacy. They had learned that being rescued by Michael Jordan was less important than what they chose to do with that rescue, how they used the attention and opportunities it created to push for changes that would benefit people they would never meet, how they transformed a moment of private humiliation into a catalyst for public conversation about issues that too many people preferred to ignore. And so Cain Williams returned his attention to the architectural drawings spread across his desk, to the practical work of designing spaces that could subtly shape human interactions in more equitable directions, to the daily grind of building something meaningful from the materials available rather than waiting for perfect conditions that would never arrive. Outside his window, the neighborhood was settling into evening routines that connected this moment to countless others, stretching backward through time and forward into futures that remained unwritten. Somewhere Michael Jordan was going about his own evening, perhaps thinking occasionally about a family he had helped years ago, or perhaps focused entirely on current concerns and challenges. Somewhere Christine was living her life with whatever lessons she had or had not learned from consequences that had found her. Somewhere other families were facing their own moments of discrimination with or without intervention, with or without witnesses, adding their experiences to the vast archive of injustices both challenged and endured. The Williams family's story was exceptional in its details, but ordinary in its essence, one variation on themes that played out across the country every day in restaurants and stores and schools and countless other spaces where people encountered each other across lines of race and class and power. What made their story worth telling was not that Michael Jordan had walked through the door at the exact right moment, though that detail certainly made it more dramatic and attention-grabbing, but rather what that moment revealed about systems that required such interventions, about a society that had made such limited progress that basic dignity still depended on luck and celebrity rather than being guaranteed to everyone regardless of who was watching. The real story, the one that mattered beyond individual drama and happy endings, was about all the doors that remained closed and all the families still waiting for someone to notice their exclusion and care enough to do something about it, still working to build lives of meaning and purpose despite obstacles that should never have existed in the first, still teaching their children to be both proud and careful, ambitious and realistic, hopeful and vigilant in a world that had not yet learned to see them fully. The Williams family story reminds us that kindness can come from the most unexpected places and that standing up for what's right makes a real difference. We want to hear from you. Where are you watching this video from? Drop your city and country in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so we can keep spreading these important messages of kindness and hope to people everywhere. Your support helps us share more stories that matter. And don't go anywhere, because we have another incredible story waiting for you right now. Just click on the video appearing on your screen. Thank you for watching, and remember to always treat others with the respect and dignity they deserve.